Alright, good morning everybody. Hopefully you all had an excellent graduation weekend. I'm finally all getting recovered from mine, so I figured that we'd jump into another topic here. And so today what I want to talk about, we're going to kind of have a brief introduction to pointers. Pointers, if you haven't heard of them before, are kind of one of the integral parts of what you'll be learning when you start in CS 162, and you'll use them in many of your other classes if you continue down the computer science route, even down the ECE route as well. So they're definitely a good tool to kind of get aware of. And so today what I want to do is take a look at not their implementation, we'll look at that here in another video shortly, but mainly just their use. Why is it that we use them, and what is it? What's a common time that we'll actually see these things called pointers used? So, in order to do that, in order to understand what pointers do, we need to understand what a pointer is. So, a pointer, in its simplest form, is just a data type that we create to store an address. A pointer is just an address. And I remember when I was learning all about pointers, it used to infuriate me because I was like, alright, everyone always just says that a pointer is just an address, but they're really hard to use. We're going to try to make them not that hard to use. But that is an important thing to know, is that a pointer just stores an address. So maybe really quick, we are not going to do a whole lot of meaningful stuff with pointers yet. But let's maybe take a look at some of the syntax for them, and then we'll look at why we might use them. So if I come over here and I do something like int example equals 10, like this, I've created an integer called example and I've set it equal to 10. What I can do is I can then come down here and I can see out the address of example, okay? And what this actually does is this will show us not what the value inside of example is, but it will show us where that address is stored in memory. Here, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to see out the value of example is, and we'll actually look at what the value is inside of example, and then we'll say the address of example is. And then we'll see out that address. And remember, if I put an ampersand before a variable, it just means that I'm not using the variable itself, I'm looking at the address of that variable. Slightly different than when we're passing by reference, so don't let that confuse you. Those are two different things. This isn't passing by reference, I'm just printing out the address of a variable. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, let me pull over my terminal here. Oh, and what the heck did I call this? And we'll go into tutorial series, and we'll go into our pointer intro. Alright. So if I do a G++ in my program here and I go ahead and run this, what we should see is that the value is 10 right here on this line, but I get some really kind of weird looking thing when I print out the address, right? I get some kind of strange looking hexadecimal value here, and that's just the memory address that my integer is stored at. Okay, that's just the memory that's been allocated, the address of the memory that's been allocated to store the value of 10. So now if I come back in here, now let's take a look. What I could do, alright, let's say that I wanted to create another integer that had the value of example, right? So I'm wanting to say int example2 is going to equal example, right? I could do this, and that makes total sense, right? I can move values around integers or any other data type. But if I wanted to store the value of my address here, if this was important to me for some reason, if I wanted to store the value of that address, how would I do that? What's a data type that I can use to do that? And here's where pointers come in, right? So if I want to create a variable that I can use to store an address, what I'll do is I'll create a pointer, okay? So here's what I'll do. I'll say int, and then so I'm creating an integer pointer, and my computer's smart enough to know what I'm going to do here. I'm going to create an int star, and I'm going to call this thing, I'll call this example pointer. And this is going to equal the address of my example. Okay? So now what we'll see here is that I've got another integer that's being created that's storing the value of our original integer, and I've got a pointer, an integer pointer, that's going to store that address of our original example here. So I'm going to just copy these two lines, and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to paste them. So now let's see, and then the value, or the address. So I've changed here. I'm going to print out the value of example 2. This should be straightforward, right? We should be aware of what's going to happen when I assign one integer to another. But then down here, I'm going to print out the address of example. And now instead of actually doing it like this, I'm going to print out the variable that we've used to store that that address inside of, that pointer that we've created to store the address inside of. All right? And I'll make a couple new lines here just so that it's nice and easy to see. So let's hop on over. So what we want to see is pretty much the exact same thing, right? I'm not changing anything. I'm just storing it in different variables. Okay? So if I run this again, I do see the same thing, right? I see that my value is still 10 up here, and here's my address. And then when I come down here, my value is 10 in example 2 because we haven't changed the value. But now when I print out the pointer, I still get that same address, right? So at its base, at its core, all we've done is we've created a variable. We've created a pointer type variable right here and stored an address in it. And that is all we really ever do when we use pointers. It gets a little more complicated when we actually start to use them for some interesting things, but a pointer will ever only store an address, just like an integer will only ever store a whole number, or a character will only ever store a single character. So I hope that that's kind of helpful, at least in having an idea of what a pointer is. In the next pointer video, what we'll do is we're going to look at what's actually kind of happening under the hood and talk a little bit about why we might want to use a pointer, some of the practical applications, because here, alright, sure, maybe I want to know the address of something, but that's not super practical, at least not in the programs, for anything in the programs that you all are writing at this point. So we'll look next video at maybe some of the practical applications, and then our last kind of introduction to pointers, at least for now, we will write some code that uses pointers and actually does some stuff. Okay? So there's a quick crash course in what a pointer is, and we'll see you in the next video.